Do you hear what that does? It brings the Holy of Holies out into the open in the world, displaying publicly what's always been hidden.
Right.
So that sacrifice is not really the idea at all. Is Jesus being made a public sacrifice as much as he is being accessible to everyone.
Welcome to Grail Country. My guest today is Brian Sartor, who I've known for a while now. We keep bumping into each other. We keep taking the same classes through Paul Axton Forging Plowshares Bible Institute. And first we were in a Maximus class together, and then we were in an imaginative apologetics class together. And then we just recently wrapped up a class on René Girard. And Brian had sent me an email, and he had seen the conversation that Richard Rowland and Jonathan Pajot had on the Voyage of St. Brendan. And he asked me, the question he asked me was, why did they avoid the obvious Girardian interpretations? I'm not sure that they did. I think they're I know both of them are aware of Girard, for sure. But I think I don't want to speak for either of them, but I just think that it wasn't how they wanted to talk about it. I don't think is probably why. So I know they're both certainly aware of Girard. I know both of them. I respect both of them. I think they're good men. They're good Christians and incredibly well-meaning people. But that doesn't mean that Brian doesn't have some insight that might be helpful. So I thought this is worth exploring because it's a this topic of sacrifice, and it's the sacrifice issue is one that I had been thinking about a lot, even prior to the Girard class. But obviously, the Girard class ramped that up for me, so it's something I've been thinking through too. And but it's something I'm thinking through. It's really turns out to be a very thorny, complicated thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I definitely have said some provocative things on the issue of sacrifice, but mainly just as to spur conversation and examination, and not necessarily that I'm wedded to anything that I've said that has some rhetorical flash. For anybody who saw my recent tweet about sacrifice being a satanic inversion, there's a way in which I mean that, but I don't want to absolutize that either. But there's a way in which there is a truth in what I've said there, but I'm not going to pretend that that's the whole story. And I am very interested in exploring the questions that Brian has about sacrifice, because it is a very deep subject, and it seems to be being brought into the forefront in the zeitgeist lately too. I mean, Jordan Peterson can't stop talking about it in his new gospel series. He's talking about it constantly. It's very much on his mind. I very much have my immediate reaction to the way that Peterson talks about sacrifice is extremely negative. I don't like it. I think it's ultimately more Nietzschean than Christian, and I think there's some kind of inversion going on, that was what spurred me to that's what spurred my tweet that called sacrifice a satanic inversion of gift. And I think that might be where we want to start potentially. Although, Brian, if you have another idea, that's fantastic. I'm really, really open here. And now that I have introduced, I'm going to let you go ahead and guide the ship.
Sure. Well, I don't really know where to start. And I'm kind of like you. I don't remember where sacrifice came to the forefront for me in my thoughts and in everything I've been listening to and wanting to talk to you about specifically since the class on Girard that we just took. But certainly what led me to write you, yes, was that video where I was listening to Richard Rowland and Jonathan Peugeot talk about St. Brendan. And yeah, it was just so clear to me that the interpretation of what happened on that voyage, just with the couple of islands that they talked about, was a pretty, obscure, non-detailed, well, maybe detailed, but obscure in its meaning sort of account of what it was. And I just remembered about Girard's theory that, a lot of the myths and stories from history tend to take a certain pattern or form, such as it's obscured on maybe not on purpose.
Were you thinking specifically the talk about the part where they were talking about the part about deciding where to build the churches? Is that because they actually part of that conversation, they actually did talk about the practice of human sacrifice and the foundation.
No, it was prior to that when they were talking about the voyage, because they were talking about the fact that there were 50. Well, Richard was reading from a source, an 8th century source that said that there were 56 or 57 men in the voyage that St. Brendan was leading. It was 56 because 3 brothers came up last minute and said they wanted to go. Right. And Brendan told the guys, okay, but one of you will be die in an honorable way. The other of you will, as a result of this voyage, find yourself in hell at the resurrection. So it was, stark. And then a jester also came as the 60th person of the troop. Mm-hmm. And the jester was the last one to come. And I think the first island they came across, there were large mice on the shore. Right. And
okay, so you were thinking about it. You were thinking of a Girardian reading in terms of what happens with the jester, where he takes communion and dies.
Yeah, because it looked to me like that was a classic obscuring of an actual death. Right. Well, if you just want to go full Girard,
they seem to agree that it was that in some way. It's as I remember that conversation, they seem to be leaning toward that he had sacrificed himself for the group in some way.
Well, in the reading, it phrased it such that it was Brendan's decision. He told the jester, you will go to heaven, or something like that. And when I listened to it, I thought how clearly it seemed. You have to go back and listen.
That it looks like scapegoat selection. Is that?
Yes, and that just to me looked like kind of an obvious interpretation, and it wasn't at least what they were talking about. And just generally in the interview, it seemed like, because what's behind this, Nate, as you and I have talked about, is the question of civilizational Christianity. And yes, we get ultimately to the question of sacrifice and the role of sacrifice, the role of death and martyrdom in the establishment of civilization. So this is at the heart of it, is to ask ourselves the question for the establishment of these Christian communities, and maybe even Ireland in general. And I wouldn't say, one or two references to what could have been an obscured scapegoating incident would mean that, the founding of civilization that's in Ireland was not a good thing. But of course, it's Christian. The question of the mode that they were in for establishing domain, territory, in islands or not. The issue of there being a scapegoat sacrifice that's covered over, and it's seen to be voluntary, and the jester goes to heaven as a result of it, and is buried there, and is called a martyr. And I remember that really threw Jonathan Peugeot for a loop. Like, wait, he was a martyr?
Yeah, it did. Yeah.
And so, to me, it's like, I couldn't see it any other way, and I'd love some help if
No, I can see what you're saying. I mean, it's like, well, it's the hesitancy in wanting to read it that way is that we're talking about a medieval Christian story, right? And we're not talking about a pagan story. So we're talking about a story that's been written, talking about it from a Girardian standpoint. We're talking about a story that has been written after Christ reveals the scapegoat mechanism. So and the interesting thing is that it does seem to have, like, if it is what you're saying, and I do see, I mean, it's pretty, the resemblance is pretty obvious. I think you're right. Like, on the surface, there does seem to be a resemblance. The question is like, okay, well, what is going on? What is going on in this text as a Christian text? Does it do anything unexpected with that? And to kind of like to subvert that pattern in some way, to give a Christian spin on it, or is it in fact is it more deeply influenced by other currents that have not yet vanished?
Yeah, and I kind of want to see it as the latter, that it's a blind repetition of the pattern that in that instance is not reflective of what we see as the way Christian communities and Christian, this is the trouble talking about it, as Christian civilizations, if they are established as civilization by Christians, and they include a scapegoat sacrifice.
Well, I think there is one Christian element here that's present, and that is that it makes it very clear that he volunteers for what is happening, right? So
I don't think it did. The way it was phrased when Richard was reading it, it was Brendan's choice, and Jonathan even said it. Somebody needed to die,
right,
because these mice and whatever they represented were demanding that for them to move on in their journey, someone needed to die. And Brendan turned.
Yeah, it's really strange because it's almost like it has very much like this residue of like the spirits of the land demanding sacrifice.
Yeah. And I remember specifically it saying that Brendan was giving some good news to the jester that he was going to go to heaven today and take communion and go to heaven, and that this would be his blessing, his legacy, his final destination and arrival at where we all want to go anyway, because that was kind of the sub thing, was Richard saying, well, we have to maintain or retain some, this was the way they framed the video, some sense for the reality that as Christians, we are citizens of heaven, and our ultimate goal, we can't establish good civilization on earth if we don't have as our ultimate goal the establishment of, the beatific vision that's beyond it all. So that being the larger question, off the heels of our conversation at the splash that Kingsnorth made about Christian civilization, and this being on the table in this little corner, this video was the next big thing for me to look at it and go, this is an open, a kind of an open area for where, if you're at all inclined to speak your mind, to say, this issue that Peugeot and Roland were talking about is something that does need to be looked at a little bit more closely. Maybe use Girard and ask, is it possible that St. Brendan's journeys, in the way, at least the way they were written about now, and the fact that we know something happened, and if it was obscured by in the 4th century occurrence was obscured by the 8th century and written down to make it look like where Brendan pushed someone out of the boat against their will, that they were a martyr, then that's important.
So you're saying, I think, let me just see if I'm hearing you correctly, Brian. And I don't know that I disagree with you. I think you might be right. What you're saying is that the pattern of the story of St. Brendan looks less like a Christian story and and more like a Christian civilizational story. And because it's a Christian civilizational story, as a civilizational story, it cannot escape the mimetic circle. It has to repeat it.
Yeah, I think so. And it goes back to what you were saying earlier about this question. I haven't ever thought about whether Girard thought of his, the original or primal state of human beings as a closed system.
He gives kind of like, I'll tell you what makes me want to read Girard as like heavily leaning in that direction is that he seems to have a basically Augustinian view of human nature, and he gives lots of hints like that in his writing because he's always like, so for example, there are lots of lines in Girard where he talks about like the Rousseauing tendencies of his colleagues, right? So which is real. There's very much like in the anthropology of his time, there certainly was this idea to view like the natural state of man as like good or innocent, right? And to kind of like have like Rousseau very much is like an inspiration behind the idea of the noble savage. But that idea of the noble savage didn't stop Europeans from behaving pretty monstrously toward indigenous populations when they encountered them. So it actually ends up. You can see the way in which the idea of the noble savage kind of feeds directly right back into the mimetic cycle, right? Because you have the false glorification goes hand in hand with the eventual repudiation and murder. Like they're two sides of the same process. And so I think Girard, to me, seems to assume a very Augustinian anthropology, and that like essentially left their own devices, we're all murderers. And I don't want to come down I don't want to come down in favor of either extreme, because I don't think that it's quite right.
Well, the way I understand him is that we're not left to our own devices, and it would be fair to say that
right.
that you can't be left to your own devices, I guess, because it's not a matter of, an individual's heart, a la Augustine, as much as it is. Maybe in a general sense it is, because there's the mimetic rivalry is just there, and the way that
right, but he doesn't seem to. Here's the thing, though. Here's why I think Girard. Okay. Let me give you a very concrete example of what I think Girard misses. This is and I actually I mentioned this in my conversation with Jordan Hall that I just recorded too. And I first started thinking about, you're familiar with Ivan Illich's reading of the parable of the Good Samaritan, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, one of the things you need to understand, one of the reasons that Illich insists on reading it that way is because Illich has an intuition of the way in which what the Good Samaritan does, it's completely non-mimetic desire. He's not driven by, nor is it an animal passion of his. It's like, he's not driven by passion, and it's not mimetic. Like there's nobody in his cultural context who's doing what he does. Like there is no model for what he does. It is a pure cooperation with the human will, with the divine will, which is free from the taint of mimetic desire. But the minute the Good Samaritan, this is why Illich comes into the equation, the minute the Good Samaritan just becomes a model of, do like what the Good Samaritan did, then it does just become a cultural artifact, right? It's just you're doing it because it's the force of your culture, and the force of tradition tells you that that's what you should do. So it turns it into something that's mimetic. So the things that we need to be seeking to do are things like what the Good Samaritan does. And one of the most important features about what the Good Samaritan does is that it is inconceivable from within his frame.
Yeah. It breaks out the social boundaries. It breaks, the mores, taboos. And
right. Yes. But the tricky bit is you don't want to just go about doing things that are subversive of boundaries and taboos for the sake of because that's not, because most of those things are just going to be done out of your own perverse desires.
Yes. Well, Illich, it seemed like his whole approach and his reason for breaking that down, and his insight was, we have taken the message and the actual story of the Good Samaritan, and this is where the corruption of the best is the worst, have corrupted it as a, Kantian Enlightenment, thinkers, by taking it and saying, that's what you're supposed to do at all times and all places, is help
Which
people.
is not how it would have landed with the audience that Jesus was first telling it to. The way it would have landed with the audience was like, what?
But what may be lost in there is Illich points it out that it was based in his gut, like compassion. Yep. I think it says in the text that he was moved by compassion.
Yes. Right.
So there's a desire.
Desire mercy, not sacrifice.
Yeah. So it is from desire, and it's not necessarily. I haven't thought about whether.
Which means, but it's not like God, so God isn't choosing something random in order to contrast with sacrifice. He says, I desire mercy and not sacrifice. And then, so we have the parable of the Good Samaritan is a concrete example of that principle, right?
Yeah.
What the civilization, what the culture demands in order to create it and to sustain it is continual sacrifice, which is what allows the continuation of the wheel.
Well,
right?
let me link
of the closed circle.
Let me link these two for us in the conversation because it's very much in my mind they're linked, and I think we probably broached it, but law and sacrifice. That the structure of, like we said, taboo in the Good Samaritan's context, it's also flipped because of Illich's context of enlightenment and Kantian ethics. But what he is pointing to is that the universal is shattered, and the grounds for legal social cohesion and normalcy are shattered for the sake of what you're calling mercy, compassion, that he's moved just to help someone who needed help, and he felt like he could help them, and he wanted to help in this way, and he left some money and left, and the guy
imagine how his neighbors would have reacted watching him bring this guy home.
So here's the question: was that a sacrifice?
No, I'm saying it was precisely not a sacrifice.
Okay, now if there's different senses of the word sacrifice, which is what we get into with the questions about Girard, not making the distinction for much of his writing, not making the distinction between sacrifice as a system that deals with mimetic rivalry, and the fact that there's this good mimesis that is imitating Christ and self-sacrificing from the place of your own desire.
Yeah, I don't think self-sacrifice is any better. I think this is where I was kind of headed with, like, in trying to like put as Christian a reading on this the story from Saint Brendan as I could, the story of the fool. It's like, well, it's self-sacrifice, so that makes it okay, right? But I think this idea that self-sacrifice makes it okay, that's a delusion, because I don't think that God is looking for your self-sacrifice either. Because I'm being very particular here.
Okay, yeah.
I'm not saying that God doesn't wish for you to give of yourself completely, of everything you have, without any reservation, holding nothing back for yourself. God does expect you to do that.
Okay.
But here's the thing, though. In as much as you are able to do that, it is not a sacrifice. The reason it's not a sacrifice is because the place you operate from is the place of divine plenitude where you could never possibly have a need. So therefore, there is nothing to sacrifice.
Okay. Well, maybe it's a little bit reflective of my frame that I came at it with, which was Romans 12:1. Offer your bodies a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. And the fact that Paul doesn't mention sacrifice in that letter at all before Romans 12:1, except for a few verses in chapter 3 where he says that Christ is a propitiatory sacrifice offered, and there's some.
Well, that's okay. I think this is good, right? So this is good. This is good because you made me think of something. So the idea is that if we offer sacrifice in a human way, all we are ever doing, if we offer sacrifice in a human way, which comes out of the mindset of scarcity and limit and boundedness, then it's always wrong. Because when Christ makes a sacrifice, yet he has become a human being, but he does it but he sacrifices in a divine way, and not in a human way, and
assuming abundance.
Right? Exactly right. And yes, everything Christ does and says clearly operates from this assumption of abundance, and that's the one thing he's never even able to get through the disciples' skulls. Like they don't ever get it.
Well, it's because you can't, it's not the economy we live in. It's not the world we live in.
Economy. No, I'm glad you said that. It's not the economy. So it's funny because economy, like, we think of it as such a mundane thing, right? The economy, it's like, how we buy and sell and trade and all this. But when you start thinking about economy in the philosophical depths of economy, it ends up being about how not only to how we relate to one another within the world, but it also ends up relating to we talk about the economy of the Trinity itself, like within the relations of the Trinity, but it also dictates the way in which God relates to the world. So economy ends up being a very deep subject that ends up being, like, if you're talking about economy in a really deep and profound way, it ends up becoming a theory of everything.
Yeah, let me back up, because when you said, hey, let's get on and talk about that video and what you saw about it that you thought needed to be addressed, that was, that was missed. You immediately said, I think we have to talk about sacrifice in the context of scarcity and abundance. And that's when you said it, but then I brought up the loaves and fishes because I associate scarcity and abundance with
that's when I knew that I definitely wanted to talk to you when you brought that up, because I did, like, several years ago, I did like a 2-hour video talking about that verse.
That when you sent it. And to be clear, when I typed that email, that was the first time I'd had that thought, relating it back to sacrifice. And I was like, yes, there's a lot here.
Yes.
And I wouldn't say that I've figured much out since we first, a month ago, started talking about doing this.
Right. So it has to. So here's the way. This is a clever rhetorical way of talking about it. So what we need to do is we need to learn to make the sacrifice that is not a sacrifice. And it's not a sacrifice because the reason it's not a sacrifice is because there's no sense that we had any claim over we have no sense of claim over what we're giving up. We've relinquished it. We never, and nor do we have any regret about its loss, nor do we have any doubt that it will be returned to us.
Yeah.
All at the same time.
A simple way of seeing that is life is abundant. Hey, it's eternal. Life is here. It's given. And this man, this first century Nazarene who took 5 loaves and 2 fishes and turned it into a meal for 5,000 people, and his disciples didn't realize, when he's around, we don't have to worry about scarcity and do our whole economy in the way that we've always done it.
Which, right. And the reason I want to talk to Jordan Hall is, like, to me, though, that's the principle. That is if there's a game B, that's what principles are. I would say that game B is just the kingdom of God. Well, the difference between the kingdom of God and the kingdom of men is that there is no scarcity in the kingdom of God.
Right. So it begins with life, time. You mentioned time.
Yes.
Your own resources and giftedness. And this is what it's about. I did write this down. The goal or the model is not the fact that we have scarce resources such as land or objects of desire. The goal or model is an abundant source, which is a person.
Yeah.
So those two things, goal and model, like where are we headed? What's our focus? What's our aim that defines us?
Right.
What is our model? Who are we imitating? We are imitating a person who takes 5 loaves and 2 fishes and turns them into a meal.
And every system we build and every model that we set up, we have never built a system or ever set up a model that didn't assume as its very first principle among first principles, resources are limited.
Mm-hmm.
Things are scarce.
Yeah.
What happens if we stop assuming that and we imagine there is enough if we learn to seek and find?
So what is game B essentially? You mentioned game A. I mean, I can kind of get it that, an economy as usual is game A. Game B is an open-ended question for what we construct that we, think of and do and implement next as a species. Is that right?
Yeah, essentially it was trying to it was a bunch of really smart people who were trying to within a secular and scientific way try to conceive of a different possible game. And they all had different they never solved the problem, big surprise.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know I just talked to Jordan Hall, who was involved in it, and Jordan Hall, at least now, he definitely sees, I just talked to him, so I know he definitely sees this idea of plenitude being at the ground of what I would just call the kingdom of God.
Right. And I think that we can call it the kingdom of God for sure, and act in that way and spread the gospel in this way, right, and talk about it in this way, and act, and just live in this way.
Right. And here, this is why, and this actually gets back to the Kingsnorth's critique of civilizational Christianity, right? Because one of the ways in which civilizational Christianity has gone astray in the past and will continue to go astray in the future is that it has no problem preaching the gospel about Jesus as if that were enough on its own. But Jesus also preached the gospel, right? So there's this gospel about Jesus, which in most of its, contemporary formulations is, believe and be saved or something like that. It's a kind of a beliefism. And it's very thin and it's very shallow, and it really doesn't impact the way people live in the world very much at all. But then you also have the gospel that Jesus announced, which is that the kingdom of God is among you. The kingdom of God is within you. The kingdom of God is here. It is arrived. It is present. Live into it. That's the gospel that we still have no ability to take seriously.
Mm-hmm.
And the reasons for that are very complicated. But one of the primary reasons is that we still want to keep sacrificing in the way that we always have been, and we want to keep the wheel turning.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's as much out of fear as anything else.
Mm-hmm. I think your words about not wanting, doing away with sacrifice altogether, and that self-sacrifice is still sacrifice, is something I'm trying to process and maybe get to the bottom of it, because it certainly is language, I think, that trips us up. For one,
well, yeah, but you can see it. It has to do with your internal orientation toward what you're doing, right? And here's the thing, is that self-sacrifice ends up being transactional too. Because usually when you're engaging in self-sacrifice, you're doing it in order to ingratiate yourself to power and try to put power on your side. You're still, the self-sacrifice is still working within the master and slave dynamic, essentially. Because there's no, because when, just think about your emotional reaction when you hear the word sacrifice. You don't say, "Yay, I'm going to go out and sacrifice today," right?
But if Jesus was a sacrifice, and we can talk about the word, like, and just bring kenosis into this, that self-emptying and being moved by compassion for other people being a good thing that we imitate in Christ, and that's just love. And this is love. I mean, this is a good thing. That sacrifice, I can see why we want to get away from it. But the thing is that in Scripture, there are I think they actually are twists, like they turn the idea, I mean, Hebrews 8-10 definitely does this, turns sacrifice on its head to be something completely other than it's ever been. And I think Paul does that in Romans. It's the reasons why he only mentions it twice. And there's also the issue of, well, when we say sacrifice, are we talking about just doing something kind, something good that pleases God? Or is it necessarily have appeasing God in order to get on his good side? Does it necessarily take that connotation as it does apparently mostly in the Western theology?
Yeah, and I think like a lot. I mean, I don't know how much of this is just like because of our language, right? And the way that sacrifice functions like as an English word, and in a language that is full of tendencies toward transactional frames to begin with. Like, I mean, it's just like, the whole the English are a nation of shopkeepers thing, There's something real behind that saying. It's like there's a way in which our language definitely lends itself very easy to kind of transactional kind of metaphors. And to me, the English word sacrifice the reason I don't like the word sacrifice, or if I want to talk about sacrifice correctly, I would want to call it the sacrifice that's not a sacrifice, is that I don't think there's any way with our English word sacrifice of removing the transactional element from it. And the reason for that is that if I talk about making a sacrifice, then whatever I sacrifice, from a standpoint of the English word sacrifice at least, has to belong to me in some sense.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Or it's not a sacrifice.
Yeah.
It's like it's not. There's no sacrifice if what I'm giving up belongs to somebody else. Then it not only is it not sacrifice, it could be considered theft. Right? So it has to do with the way in which like sacrifice is caught up with our notions of possession. Well, our notions. So that means that this thread is not incidentally related to the idea of plenitude either, because the need to have mine own, and possession is directly tied to our unwavering belief in scarcity, which is precisely the thing that we need to stop believing in order for the principles of the kingdom to begin to emerge. And everything we've ever built and everything we've ever done always assumes that to be the case.
Yes.
I want to turn this really quickly. I want to use that to magnify this idea of the divine sacrifice and sacrificing divinely. So it seems like in Leviticus, God says that the land belongs to him. Like just naturally, the sense is that everything belongs to God. And in the Mass, we say during the sacrifice of the Mass, we say, "Of your own have we given you." So there's a way in which we are acknowledging that everything belongs to God. And if everything, and here's the thing, well, how does divine sacrifice work? Well, divine sacrifice gives entirely of everything that by rights belongs to God without reservation, including the gift of God's own self to the creation and the incarnation. So God withholds nothing. God's gift to us is without limit. So he's actually given us the fullness of his own plenitude. And so when it's scarcity,
I think the heart of our liturgy being communion, the Lord's Supper, and I'm holding off because the word Eucharist, what does it mean? It's the great Thanksgiving. So
right.
You're giving thanks for abundance.
Yes.
That you're right. It's the opposite.
And we do have these right. And let's not forget, like when we read sacrifice, it's a translation. We're reading something that comes from another language that's translating another word. And it's like, I think there are actually I was talking to one of my Jewish friends recently, and there are like 24 words in Hebrew for sacrifice, but none of them have the same connotations as our English word sacrifice. So there certainly can be an offering up, a thanksgiving, an offering of mercy, like all of those things.
Well, one of the translations of there's a word that's used twice in the New Testament. I've referred to Hebrews 9, I think it's verse 5.
Okay.
And Romans 3:25, I believe it is. But it's, I think, hilasmos, but it's translated sacrifice in Romans. I'm not sure what 12:1, what the word is for that. But in Hebrews, it's translated mercy seat.
Okay.
So there's mercy. I mean, and if you bring that back, if you translated the word that's translated mercy seat in Hebrews in this passage in Romans, it would say this: being justified, verse 24, by his grace through the redemption which is in Christ Jesus, whom God displayed publicly as a mercy seat. Do you hear what that does? It brings the Holy of Holies out into the open in the world, displaying publicly what's always been hidden.
Right.
So that sacrifice is not really the idea at all. Is Jesus being made a public sacrifice as much as he is being accessible to everyone.
Right. And there's and so I'm going to get a little radical on you here.
Please do.
So bear with me. So are you familiar with the Edwin Muir poem Transfiguration by chance?
No. Who?
Edwin Muir.
No.
He wrote a poem. It's called Transfiguration. But the ending of the poem Transfiguration is interesting because first of all, he's imagining like the world set right, and yet somehow the world is changed entirely and unchanged at the same time, right? It's just his way of it's his way of seeing that's been transformed, but the world actually remains much as it was before. But eventually he comes out of the state and loses the vision that happened for a moment. But at the very end of the poem, he talks about undoing the betrayal of Judas and undoing the crucifixion of Christ, which are dogmatically anathema for Christians. And yet there's something in Muir's poetic imagination that I think there is profoundly right, because first of all, I don't know how fixed the world of linear time is. And second of all, we can imagine a world that accepted the gospel of Jesus instead of crucifying him and preaching the gospel about Jesus. And at some point, I think we need to have both things together.
Hmm.
And a friend of mine wrote a piece on his Substack a while back, like kind of like chasing the same thread as Muir in Muir's poem called "Undoing the Crucifixion." And I think, to me, and then my wife is Jewish, and so the Jews have this. The Jewish tradition has this idea of tikkun olam, of the repair of the world. And to me, as Christians, it's not thinkable that the repair of the world is the discrucifying of Christ.
Well, is it discrucifying? Maybe it's not the way I was thinking about it, because to me, Judas and Jesus, I mean, what is forgiveness if it's not behaving or proceeding as if it never happened?
Right.
So it's the Muir's poem seems to me in Transfiguration, maybe it's not, it does seem radical, and it does seem like, yeah, someone can help us see why that breaks down. But
maybe actually, you know what? Maybe just to give you some let me just go ahead and it's not that long. Let me just read the poem
read it
to give you some context. I might cry.
All right, before you do,
I haven't made it through this poem without crying yet, but I have.
Well,
yeah,
I might cry when I say this. I wanted to say it first because we were talking about forgiveness. It really struck me when Michael Hardin said this on one of his, interfaces with Paul Axton. He was saying, human beings don't learn anything new. And when he said anything new, I'm thinking Ecclesiastes, there's nothing new under the sun.
Yeah.
Unless, actually, put it this way.
No.
He said, we don't learn anything new except through forgiveness.
Right. That's good.
So if forgiveness is what turns historical events into, that were wrongs. It was Judas's wrong, and everyone abandoning Christ in his faithfulness that caused his death.
That's great, because that's tied to everything we've been talking about. That's like tied to why mercy and not sacrifice. It's tied to this like strange, unthinkable action of the Good Samaritan. Like those are like something new enters the world because of his cooperation with the will of God, which is, guess what? Mercy.
Yeah. Changes everything.
It changes everything. And so I think, like, on that's the perfect note to go into the poem, because that's what this poem is about, essentially. The Transfiguration. So from the ground we felt the virtue branch through all our veins, so we were whole. Our wrists as fresh and pure as water from a well. Our hands made new to handle holy things. The source of all our seeing rinsed and cleansed, till earth and light and water entering there gave back to us the clear unfallen world. We would have thrown our clothes away for lightness, for even they, though sour and travel-stained, seemed like our flesh, made of immortal substance. And the soiled flax and wool lay light upon us, like friendly wonders, flower and flock entwined, as in a morning field. Was it a vision? Or did we see that day the unseeable, one glory of the everlasting world, perpetually at work, though never seen since Eden locked the gate that's everywhere and nowhere? Was the change in us alone, and the enormous earth still yet left forlorn, an exile or a prisoner. Yet the world we saw that day made this unreal, for all was in its place. The painted animals assembled there in gentle congregations, or sought apart their leafy oratories, or walked in peace the wild and tame together, as if also for them the day had come. The shepherds' hovels shone, for underneath the soot we saw the stone clean at the heart, as on the starting day. The refuse heaps were grained with that fine dust that made the world. For he had said, to the pure, all things are pure. And when we went into town, he with us, the lurkers under the doorways, murderers with rags tied round their feet for silence, came out of themselves to us and were with us. And those who hide within the labyrinth of their own loneliness and greatness came. And those entangled in their own devices, the silent and the garrulous liars, all stepped out of their dungeons and were free. Reality or vision, this we have seen. If it had lasted but another moment, it might have held forever. But the world rolled back into its place, and we are here, and all that radiant kingdom lies forlorn, as if I had never stirred. No human voice is heard among its meadows, but it speaks to itself alone. Alone it flowers and shines and blossoms for itself, while time runs on. But he will come again, it said, though not unwanted and unsummoned, for all things, beasts of the field, and woods and rocks and seas, and all mankind from end to end of the earth, will call him with one voice, in our own time, some say, or at a time when time is right. Then he will come, Christ the uncrucified, Christ the discrucified, his death undone, his agony unmade, his cross dismantled. Glad to be so, and the tormented wood will cure its hurt and grow into a tree in a green springing corner of young Eden. And Judas damned take his long journey backward from darkness into light and to be a child beside his mother's knee, and the betrayal quite undone and never more be done.
I like the word discrucified now.
Yeah. There's a thing. There's a way in which, like, I think this is like, I know this like strains the bounds of orthodoxy to talk in this way, but there's a way, like Tomberg says in Meditations on the Tarot, and I think he has this right, that all idolatry is idolatry of power. And he also is just like unequivocal in refusing to allow God any of the blame for human evils in history. And he says that those who wish to do so prefer a God Almighty to the one who was crucified, to the crucified one. The God is crucified in history. However, if we are to ever make recompense and truly repent en masse, if there is to ever be a parousia, I don't think that the Christ that we get is necessarily still to be thought of as the crucified one, because history itself will have been redeemed.
I can't argue with that. I feel like that whole thing where the only thing left from history is the nail scars in his hands might have just been taken care of. Brush that.
Right.
Brush that aside now. It's not even going to be that.
But there's a way. I mean, again, it's like I don't want to go too far with that. I mean, there's a beauty to it, and I like it. But at the same time, it's like I can say things like the other way too, where it's like, well, like, to be real is to have a history. And part of that history might, might involve some scars along the way. But I don't think, here's the thing though, I don't think, like, can those things pass into the next age? Can those things truly pass beyond history into the next age? And I would say no, because to do so, you're in some very subtle way, with maybe a beautiful sadness to it, which is that's kind of the device that myth uses too, right? Right?
That who uses?
That myth, like this beautiful sadness. Yeah. Like that you're very subtly giving evil some kind of real ontology and ultimacy.
Yeah.
When I was speaking at my conference, like shortly after my cancer diagnosis, I introduced the speakers on the second day, and I read a bit from Bulgakov's Jacob's Ladder, and then I talked for a little bit. And one of the things I said in that talk is that ultimately God actualizes all possible goods, and the only things that are forgotten are our sins. And so there's a way in which our scars have to go away. Our scars have to go away, and that there's something wrong about thinking that our suffering defines us. It may help. The suffering may play a role in leading us along the path, but it doesn't define us. And to think that it defines us, I think, is like it's a romantic lie.
On that, one of the we talked about scarcity and abundance, and there's another piece of this I wanted to bring up that I don't know if we'll have time to talk about it. Certainly, there's a lot to tease out about it, but there's two German words that I've paired together: Sehnsucht and Gelassenheit. So, Sehnsucht I get from reading C.S. Lewis about far green fields, and basically what Roland and Peugeot were talking about in terms of the vision for a heavenly, destination as we establish civilizations.
Right.
So there's this experience, and gosh, we've all had it probably, of Sehnsucht, which is basically nostalgia or longing for a distant place, a distant country that we're not currently in. We just want it, and it keeps us going. This is the sort of a theology of desire C.S. Lewis was a big proponent of. Well, I wouldn't just necessarily oppose it to Gelassenheit, but the German word Gelassenheit is used by the Amish. I believe the translations for that would be something like detachment or reckless abandon, just contentment, satisfaction,
right,
unassociated with peace, of just things will be what they will be, and it's a sense of, I don't know, maybe we'll have to define it as we go, but to take the strong drive and longing for something that we don't have access to right now, that barks of scarcity to me.
Yeah, you're right. Yes, that's exactly right.
And Gelassenheit resonates with just the fact that things are abundant. I think you referred to it with Jordan Daniel Wood. I remember in one of his classes talking about, he actually used the word Gelassenheit, talking about throwing away one of his young child's pieces of artwork because you can't hold on to them all, because your house and life just gets filled with these scraps, and the fact that he found perfect peace and just letting go. That's the translation.
Yeah.
of letting go. Because
right. Yeah. No, letting go is the
God's
perfect.
eternal. What'd you say? God's actualizing all things.
Yeah. Yeah. All possible goods. Yeah.
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 So there's abundance.
I stole that line from Jordan, by the way. So
okay, good. And we can have we can have a sense of Gelassenheit. I would call it Sabbath too. Here and now, each consecutive moment of our lives, because of what we're talking about.
Well, this actually relates to the way in which Pageau and Peterson will both talk about sacrifice in terms of attention, right? So, thinking that because your attention goes to one thing and not another, thinking of that in terms of sacrifice is also limited by, created by a frame that is assuming scarcity. Whereas if you really trust that God will reveal all things to you in God's own time, then you don't feel that sense of competition for your attention.
Well, this is where law comes back in, because my interpretation of Genesis chapter 3 and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is that we are constantly, when we are living according to law, doing what they're describing, which is purposefully fixing our attention on something specific for specific reasons and distinguishing it from this other thing here. And that's what we do with good and evil. If we're in that mode of living according to the knowledge that we gained when we ate the fruit.
There's a way in which like the act of like of taking from the tree of knowledge of good and evil is also, it's a grasping. Mm-hmm. It's relating to this. It's related to this, the way in which we want to know things in terms of how they're graspable, which is to be concerned with things for their use and purpose to us, right? Which takes us away from. This is why I think, by the way, this is the reason why we can't. I actually think we can see. I actually think that Kant is wrong from day one, because we actually can. We actually can experience the thing in itself, in as much as we are looking at it and allowing it to be what it is, and not looking at it for how we can use it or what purpose it serves for us.
Yeah, and that does away with the whole issue and of attention. Like you have to look away from idiosyncrasies, or you have to have attention. You have to avoid blemishes on things or something in order for something to be whole. That I'm trying to figure out what it is.
Goethe's methods of scientific observation are really an example of like a better way to look at the world. Mm-hmm. And I think that it's interesting because a science that operated in accordance with Goethean principles instead of like Newtonian principles would be a very different science. Hmm.
This question of, I don't know how it applies to science so much, but yeah, I'm fascinated with.
Well, I'll tell you how it applies to science. Here's how it applies to science. Okay, so science. Well, ultimately, what the word science just means knowing, right? Okay, so all of our science to date has been knowing things in accordance with the principle of grasp, right? It's been about mastery over the world. It's about how we can make things useful to us and how we can make things serve us.
Mm.
But there's a way of knowing it that operates in precisely the opposite way. That asks the question, not how can things of the world be of service to us, but how we can be in service to them.
Mm.
And that is a pathway to a very different science, very different way of knowing that leads to very different outcomes.
Yeah, I mean, abundance and relationality serve it right up for you to that.
Exactly right.
I appreciate these things in terms of, I'll take it back to Genesis 3, where the tree of life is just that. It's the presence and the abundance where we're not grasping and doling out, rationing out, and metering out, in binary.
Well, and of course, here's the interesting thing, Brian, too. And Father John Baer points this out, and he gets this from Gregory of Nyssa, that in the scriptures it says that there are two trees in the center of the garden. But how can two trees can't be both in the exact center of the garden, right? Yeah. So the two trees are really one tree.
Yeah, so I'm mathematically.
So it's an orientation, right? It comes down to our orientation.
A mode of approach is the language I use, and this gets back to. I'm always going to bring it back to law and spirit, because it was a big deal for me. I've studied Romans quite a bit. To look at Romans as basically Paul is analyzing the concept of law as he's trying to frame the good news and the way it breaks down social distinctions between persons, Jew and Gentile. So as he talks about, where was I going with that? Law and spirit is the fact that he never pits law against spirit. And I was reading a commentator who said this, and I was like, wow, well, this is why this was very clarifying for me, for Paul to never say, and he said actually the law is good. So for him to never say law is bad, it's opposed to spirit, it's not. Law is good. It's our approach to law.
Correct.
Paul Axton says it's our orientation to the law. And Paul never decries the whole existence of our knowledge of good and evil. It's
why are you doing the law? If you're keeping the law because it's the law, that your orientation is wrong.
Yeah. So
you do not keep the law simply because it is the law. That is not enough.
This is where my little maxim about source matters, because resource and source. Law is a resource where all things are limited resources, and we navigate or negotiate them by law, going this way and that, and directing our attention according to our purpose. But then in reality, the truth is that the source of law is spirit and person, and we have direct access to that. There's no mediator. The source and person of the tree of life is what we originally intended. That's how we were intended to be oriented to the tree, is through relationality and assuming abundance. Right. But to grasp at the tree, and I think with Gregory of Nyssa, it's the same tree. Because if you look at Genesis, it doesn't rule that out. You can't rule that out by the language in the text. It says, something to the effect of the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which means it could be one tree with two names.
Right, so, exactly right.
And the names are determined by the way that you approach it. So it's all in your mode. It's all in
Yeah.
your orientation.
Right. Well, that's like right, because here's the thing. Well, it's like the scripture that says that Christ did not consider equality with God a thing to be grasped. Right. So it's like Christ's equality with God comes precisely out of his not grasping for it.
Yeah.
Of his receipt of it. He receives it as the pure gift of his own being, and then he doesn't hoard it for himself. Like God, he gives everything, including his own self, away.
Okay, right there is where sacrifice can come back into it, because in an
Correct.
analogy,
That's what I'm saying. It's like as long as you can conceive of a sacrifice that is done divinely, then it can come back into it, because when the sacrifice is done divinely, it comes from the place of the divine plenitude. So it's like it doesn't matter how much is given away, because it comes out from an inexhaustible source.
Mm-hmm.
So you can give all, and there's still, you haven't begun to touch what's there.
Yeah, and I guess that's implicit in 12:1 of Romans, where the sacrifice is a living sacrifice, and if it's a living sacrifice, it's not a sacrifice.
It's not a human sacrifice. It's many senses, right? So
life has not been taken, right?
Correct, exactly. No life has been taken, and nothing is exhausted.
Because life has been given from an eternal source.
Bingo.
So I'm with you in wanting to say accurately.
That's why I want to push those buttons, because I want to get at like all the connotations and all of the subconscious baggage that comes with our English word sacrifice. Before I'm willing to say yes to sacrifice in any way, I want to make sure that we have a full consciousness of all the wrong things that are associated with that word.
Well, it is helpful to say sacrifice that's not a sacrifice, because that
right, exactly. That's right. Yeah, I will say that. I will say the sacrifice that is not a sacrifice. Just as Christianity is the religion that's not religion.
Yeah, I like that too. Is this Derrida? So what was I going to go with that? There's I guess back to Roland and Peugeot about the St. Brendan's video, because if what we are to be about as Christians, and I'm happy to just leave this the question of culture building or not. Is that what we're doing?
Right.
I probably am, at the end of the day, I'd have to explain myself a lot to get there, but I'm an anarchist like you. Like I don't think that there's any necessity in being involved in politics as a Christian. I'll put it that way. I mean, I don't think it's a bad thing if you're
God's not building a polis, God's building a family.
Yes.
I mean, that's like, and like the fact that he's building a family seems to me to be pretty obvious from scriptures. It's like, yes, I know that we do have the image of the New Jerusalem in Revelation, but I still don't think it's like I still don't think it's a city in the same way that the polis is.
Yeah. So what's the foundation of that family, and what's the foundation of civilization as we know it, and in civilization as we could possibly create it?
Right.
That's the question that I think.
It's the plenitude versus scarcity thing. I think is like right at the well, and that's pretty obvious from what is said about the New Jerusalem, right? There's no There's no scarcity.
Yeah.
There's no scarcity there.
Streets of gold is not a resource. It's a reflecting of abundance from the source. But in this little corner where I appreciated your, someone monikered you an outsider, insider. I would say I'm the same in that I love to listen and follow and interact about the content in this little corner. But I feel like, I just say insider because I can freely participate and do at least tune in. Mm-hmm. But an outsider too, because I basically disagree with the premise of just about every conversation that I hear coming from it that has to do with civilizational Christianity, or Constantinian Christianity, or, the whole orientation to what we're doing when we interact with culture, or when we talk about foundations for culture. To me, there's a very important piece of the conversation that Paul Kingsnorth reintroduced.
Well, I think I want to say, in all fairness to Peugeot, who's been nothing but just an absolute. He's been so kind to me. So first of all, just like on a personal level, Jonathan Peugeot has never been anything but amazingly kind and warm with me, and every conversation that I've ever had with him has been productive. So I want to say that. And then I also think that he thinks about these things in a very sophisticated way.
No doubt.
And in a very sophisticated way. And sometimes I find myself bristling at some of the conclusions he ends up with. But at the same time, he's very deeply insightful. And I will say this. He has a very good sense of trying to balance between the extremes that could get expressed. And understands the way in which Christianity exists, quite often, between these polarities.
Between that, his good faith, his insight, and he's coming from a very opposite, I'd say, perspective to the one that I've developed over the last 20 years. And his brilliance, gosh, the level at which he has thought through these things and is able to, every time I think, he hasn't considered this or that, he'll talk about it the next time
I think if I could just convince him that the state is the beast, full stop, then I think we might.
That what?
The state is. If I could just convince him that the state is the beast, full stop, then we might have a.
Well, I guess
it's funny. Actually, the very first question I ever posed to him, he was he came on Paul Vanderklay's weekly Q&A a long time ago. And the question, and my question got read, and my question actually was quoting from a line that Bulgakov has in Sophia, the Wisdom of God, where Bulgakov just says that the state is the beast, and between the church and the state, there can never be any there can never be any real accord, because ultimately the state stands in complete opposition to the church. And his response was, I don't remember exactly what his response was, but it was a very thoughtful response. And it didn't completely dismiss. He wasn't willing to go so far as to say that, the state is the beast. I think it is. And I think there are very good reasons to think it is. But he could at least see the wisdom in the concern. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, and that's good. And certainly Paul Vanderklay's. I mean, I didn't listen to Kingsnorth's speech. I listened to Paul Vanderklay listen to Paul Kingsnorth's speech, and his glee, his glee from.
Did you catch the panel discussion that I had?
I didn't make it through that. For some reason I can't remember. I never went back to it, but
Gotcha.
I was so fascinated by it being what he called Paul Vanderklay saying, this should be on the table. And I was like, definitely should be on the table. And I want to be part of it to help. Because if I'm someone, an insider, outsider, participating in this little corner, and I'm like very much appreciative of your manner in being in this little corner, and I'm very much appreciative of the spirit of the whole conversation. I definitely want to match that and encourage that, and not be just, someone who shows up as a contrarian. But I feel like I'm very contrary in a lot of the things that I just want to say or bring up.
I think it's a space that's first of all, I think I've always acted as a force to broaden the space. And I think there are people who are in the corner who maybe are like primarily Grill Country people who might not have ever found themselves in the corner at all if it wasn't for Grill Country. And I've always tried to kind of like broaden the scope of, of who's involved in what we're doing, because what's good about it is the deep commitment to talking to each other in a very personal and relational way, even across serious disagreement. That's so fundamentally good about it, and so exactly what the culture needs. And so I think that, I expect it to. I want to continue to broaden it. I'm going to have. I've been wanting to invite Paul Axton from Fortune Plowshares on for a while onto Grail Country, and I want to get him. I kind of want to get my hooks in him. I'll be honest. I want to get my hooks on him. I want to drag him in. I want to drag him into the corner, and all the people that are following along with Paul, because there's space for that.
For sure,
there's space for that, and you know what? We're all Christians, and if we can't find ways as Christians to talk to each other across like serious political differences, then what chance does anybody else have?
Yeah, I'm eager for that, all for it, and excited about it. In fact, and I wouldn't even say that I had like hackles go up, but I was just surprised that we were talking with Roland and Peugeot. We were talking about St. Brendan, and at least in the two stories that they brought up where two guys died, the second story we didn't get to, the Island of the Bridals,
right,
where it was basically a mimicry of Joseph and Benjamin, where the cup of gold was put in the grain sack.
Right.
An item was put into the breast of one of those brothers who was promised to go to heaven, and that's where he went because he was scapegoated, or somehow if we read that in a Girardian frame.
Well, okay. So what I think it is like, okay, in as much as like, let me put it this way. This is how I actually kind of am inclined to agree with you. And I think that just because something is Christian doesn't mean that the Girardian reading isn't appropriate. And that a lot of these things are more to serve the purpose of civilizational foundation than they are the announcement of the kingdom.
Well, let's just say, sacrifice and the ritualized mimetic, scapegoating function mechanism was good for building civilization. That's what we're talking about. And the whole question of Girard, whether he I mean, I don't know that he, in relation to Rousseau and just that question of the closed system, it seemed like he wasn't bothered by that. He was just talking about what he observed. And then as he got into reading the Old Testament and certainly reading the Gospels, I mean, it seems like
I guess it's just like ultimately I wish that Girard had gone beyond the revealing the problem stage to proposing solutions, which he was remarkably poor at. And I think that and like it's kind of hard because in some ways, like the answer there is no system that's an answer. So that's part of the right, because like systems themselves are the problem.
Yeah, and also I don't think we need answers. I mean, to be honest, I know we're asking the question, what are we supposed to be doing as Christians? But I have no problem with the deconstruction aspect because Rene Girard could be seen this way, and certainly what Paul Axton.
Well, actually, Girard did have an answer that sounds on the face of it to be kind of trite, but he actually did. I think it was in his David Cayley interview where he said this. But he was asked, "Well, wow, this is quite a picture you've painted. Like, what's the solution? What's the way out of it?" And Girard's answer was for Christians to be Christian.
Yeah, that's right. That was his solution.
But he means that. But here's the thing, though. If you think that Girard means be civilizationally Christian and create Christian civilization, if that's what you think his answer means, then I think that you have not understood what Girard actually means.
Right, because he's what his the trouble, I guess we could say, is as Jesus exposed things hidden from the foundation of the world about the foundations of society and what holds things together, things start to come undone. And they do. I mean, yeah, it's taken 2,000 years, but it's also accelerating. We could say that, but it's the question is open-ended. What's the problem? Well, there is no scapegoating mechanism or ritualized sacrificial, psychological system that actually works anymore. We're all divided against each other, and things are falling apart right now, especially. And whether things will even out, we'll see before worse things happen. But we're in a position where the apocalyptic comes in, and the solution, that was the context of Girard saying it, was that we could actually embody, model, and propose solutions to the world by just imitating Christ, basically. That's not what he said in that interview.
Right, exactly right. Yeah, that's what I think Girard meant, is like...
But that is the solution.
He meant imitate Christ.
Yeah, be more Christian, to be more Christ-like, for Christians to love and to give as out of abundance, and to what does it look like? There's no answer to that except for
to be the victim that forgives. Like when you're like, if you like,
forgive, sure, absolutely, and that's the heart of it. For us to know what it is that we're supposed to do may take a few years, right? To do the thing, or start to really do the thing that feels like, okay, I think I know what at least my answer is, or our answer as a community. I don't think we have to be anxious about getting an answer.
There is an answer and there is not an answer. Like the answer is, okay, if you're looking for the answer to be the kind of graspable purpose, what purpose does it serve, how can we use it kind of answer, then there is not, that kind of answer does not exist. But I do think there's an answer. I think like it's interesting because Tomberg in Meditations of the Tarot, he follows up on letter 10, which is the Wheel of Fortune, which describes the world that operates in in accordance with the principle of the serpent, the closed circle world, which he contrasts with the world, with the spiral, the open circle world, which is open to the Sabbath, where there's room for God and for the human cooperation with God. So he presents that problem, and he talks about the way in which religious revelation has actually all of it has addressed that closed circle problem in one way or another. So, for example, he talks about like the Buddha essentially offering people a means of escape from the closed circle world, right? But he says that the difference between, say, like the Buddhist idea of escape or other approaches to like the closed circle problem, the only one that gives any possibility of transformation is the Christian story of resurrection, because it's the Christian story for resurrection that allows not only for the circle of the closed world to be broken open, but for it to be transformed.
Yeah.
And he then follows up immediately. Letter 11 it's the arcanum of force. But here's the thing. When Tomberg talks about force, first of all, the image on the card is a young woman who seems to have like opening the jaws of a lion. But he talks about how like it's obvious from the phenomenology of the card that the brute strength of this woman is not what's opening the mouth of the lion. That the lion voluntarily is opening its mouth for the woman, and the woman on the card is a symbol of essentially of the power of the Virgin, or the power of the Virgin, which is the arcanum of force, and that force, which turns out to be ultimately the ultimate force that moves all things, is non-coercive love.
Yeah. Yes.
And so that
love is what makes us, well, we'll put it this way, because of resurrection, because of the abundant life, and because of the openness to eternity that we have been given as gift, we can afford, there's the economic word, we can afford,
they always pop up when you're talking about these things.
I know. We can afford to love. And
right.
So I love the kitschy phrase of pay it forward, because it keeps the economy thing, but it also it's not like, at least.
Well, economy is one of those things where it's like it's actually, economy is ultimately, it has to be caught up with the way in which we relate to each other.
Yeah.
You know? And so right now, and if plenitude is the real story and non-coercive love is really the force that drives everything, then the economy of the kingdom will be an economy of pure gift. It necessarily so. Like, first of all, everything that you have has already been given to you by God.
Yeah. And gift is the language in Romans, chapter 3, chapter 6. Mm-hmm. Well, all through Paul, really. It's showing up in Hebrews, I think, too, as I read that. But like, it's radical, and forgiveness, and just being given something that actually it's in our nature, it's in our patterns, usual patterns, even after conversion. Christians have this pattern to work for it, or to labor, or for in the sense of earning or managing, or just the anxious toil of getting it right is the opposite of living in abundance and living as a recipient of gift and grace. And so there's a lot that we, of course, could continue to cover about these topics. I'm so glad you brought in.
Yeah. I think this is a good start, and I think we're getting to a good place to wrap up. But I'm happy to continue talking for sure.
Yeah, we should.
Maybe we could get Paul involved. Paul
absolutely. Yeah, I think that's a great idea. And I don't know what format we could. I know we've done the one video before where the four of us. And however we continue that, it could be a part of it as well. But also, we could also make it a new thing that is focused on sort of. I mean, well, it brings back Brad and Brian because we are the insider outsider of this little corner. I mean,
right.
You know, really, probably, and this is the saving factor here. The only reason I really watch so much of this little corner is because of Brad.
Right.
And he's the one person I've been in constant conversation with as someone I disagree with over the last 4 years or more, as we discussed. And my reason for staying engaged in things I would have dismissed long ago is because of Brad.
Right.
And my reason for being here talking to you and being in so enthralled with videos that are put out by this, because I probably would have stopped listening even to Jordan Peterson a long time ago, if I wasn't still trying to either listen or convince Brad, depending on my mode.
Right. Yeah, sure. No, I think it's great that you and Brad, find a way to talk through your differences and stay in communication. And I think that because of that personal bond, that puts you in a state where I think because of your deep connection, you know that whatever he sees, it's not nothing. And it might not be something that you can see within your frame, but you're going to try to see it because you trust him enough to know that it's not nothing. And likewise, he trusts you enough to continue keep the dialogue open because he has the same realization. And you know what? You're both right.
I think so. And I mean, I really do at one level get that. At another level, yeah, I reject that. But
I understand.
But
that's always the way it is. Because you can't see what you don't see until you see it.
Here's what I can see. He and I would be well served to include more people in the back and forth, mainly for accountability's sake and y'all's input about what the actual issues are, like you and Paul defined that day. What we're talking about is reality. Small thing. Reality. We're talking about the nature of reality and our disagreement about, Maximus, the confessor, and our interpretation of John 1 and our understanding of what Paul is saying about the law. All of these things are just things that can become tools or weapons that we pick up to sort of combat each other with and never get anywhere.
Right.
And for me, it's fruitful and fertile to be involved because I feel like, hey, I just gave a clever answer. That's what I think right there. But it actually is not that great because it's better to be out here in this little corner and interacting with all you guys who are actually thinking about very similar things and could be drawn into and enriched by the breadth of things that our disagreement, Brad and I, has touched on and woke up and sort of refined in terms of what some of the actual issues are. Like, I really do think this civilizational question is central. So let's keep on and pick it up again with however we want to, or decide
absolutely. Yeah, let's do it. Yeah, absolutely. Maybe talk to Paul and see if he wants to get involved, or Brad, be welcome too. I'd love to continue the conversation.
Yeah, with the back and forth, the question of what to focus on, I think, is important. Like,
we can work that out. We can work that out through email. I think we can kind of just hammer a direction.
Yeah.
An idea.
Yeah. Well,
I agree on some framing and some talking points beforehand.
Yeah, it seems like there's so much more to say about sacrifice, but I do kind of.
It is well. I mean, I think you nailed it when you said that what we're talking about is the nature of reality. So it's like my tweet that I had a couple weeks ago that I shared with you, that sacrifice is an satanic inversion of the gift. I also said in that same tweet that sacrifice does create and sustain a world. The question is, what kind of world does it sustain and create? And is that the world that God intends?
Yeah, are we really doing anything when we contribute to building that world?
Right. I think it's repetitive false incarnation.
Yeah.
And essentially, I mean, all false incarnation is a failure to take Christ as the model, ultimately, right? To throw it back into Girard's court. If Christ is truly your model, then you can't you won't create false incarnations. But just because I say Christ is my model doesn't mean Christ is my model, and also the version of Christ that I have created may not be faithful to the real person of Jesus Christ.
Yeah, and to me, you're talking about the last 1,600 plus years of taking Christ as model for saying that we take Christ as model.
Correct.
For our polity, our governing, our authority for the state and organized human civilization.
Yeah. Is Jesus okay with the status quo?
Yeah.
That's the question I would ask. I would ask every conservative Christian that I know, is Jesus really okay? And that is an evergreen question. I don't care, like, you could ask that in any moment of history. Mm-hmm. And if you think the answer is Jesus to that question is, yeah, sure, Jesus is okay with the status quo, but I think you've deluded yourself.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's do it. Let's do it. I think that, don't feel like we got into very much what I would have wanted to about, particularly, and with all respect, Jonathan Peugeot, and the question and method for articulating a universal history. I find very much the core of what needs to be talked about, what needs to be on the table. And for Richard Rowland to bring it up in the way he did, that we need to have this, and remember that this is a driver for this perspective. It's I associate the word, what did he say? For civilization building, we have to realize that our citizenship is one of heavens. And for that to be where, the jester and the first brother were sent as a reward for being pushed over the side of the boat or whatever, or given to the the hermit or the trapped people who were requiring a sacrifice, or whatever the story was that we actually don't know, because it wasn't written down, because it probably would have. I mean, my assumption is St. Brendan would not come out looking very good. Pushing a jester or a brother off the side of the boat and rowing away is kind of what I think happened, and I can't see it any other way. And I'd love to be proven, wrong. and is it truth telling to whitewash something like that and say this is Christian civilization? I don't think so.
Right. Well, I mean,
I think that's in some ways that's what myth always does, and that's a very Girardian statement.
Right.
So the whole premise of myth and the whole premise of symbolic world, to me, has to reckon with this whole issue that we're talking about. So you can cut this out of the video.
No. I don't want to cut it out, because so this is interesting. So this is maybe something that I also want to take issue with Girard with, because I think that part of the pattern of myth genuinely operates in anticipation of Christ, and it doesn't that myth doesn't only serve to obfuscate the operation of mimesis.
Mm-hmm.
That's not all it does. There's a way in which myth also expresses a longing for what comes to be in the incarnation.
Yeah, and that's kind of always the way I've looked at it too, from C.S. Lewis's statements to that effect.
Yes, and Tolkien. Yeah, Tolkien as well.
And I love the question of how we get from just being, Nate Hile or Brian Sartor, born here, born there, to sons of God. How we get from one to the other.
Well, we know from the example of Jesus, right, that it is not a thing to be grasped.
Yes, and the whole question, what I'm pointing to is yes.
And this is what that's not a random comment, because
no.
The project of civilization seems to be inevitably caught up with trying to grasp it, to achieve mastery over the world on our own terms, rather than to live in harmony with the creation.
Mm. Yeah, and particularly I'm thinking about the value of Nate Hile and where he was born, and Brian Sartor and where he was born, and all the myths surrounding that, all the stories, legends, if that's what they were, and what I'm referring to is ancient myth. I'm referring to ancient people and how we can talk about universal history. I don't want that to be something that I deconstruct and, dismiss. I want to understand how it is that all the peoples of the earth can be in the family of God.
Right.
And what is the role of myth in that? Because to be a pure Girardian about it and say what I said a while ago, which is all myth does is obscure the true story of what happened, and usually it's a murder. I don't want to just do that easily. I need Brad and Jonathan Peugeot and Richard Rowland to interact with me about that, which is a contrary position they didn't bring up in the video.
Right.
That I think that in our interaction about different perspectives, radically different perspectives on the whole civilization issue and the role of myth, I know that I will come away with a healthy understanding and respect and role for myth. I'm not wanting to do away with it and burn it down. I'm just saying.
I'm gonna come at this in a way that seems a little bit aslant probably, but I think you'll pick out where I'm going with this. So Peugeot, one of the things he said in his own, when he talked to Paul Vanderklay, and they were talking about the King's North against Christian civilization speech, he talked about how he read it as the kings of the nations. The text says nations. The king is identified with the nation. I get that, and I don't want to get into the semantics of whether it's kings or nations. But for his reading, it was kings. He talked about it in Revelation. In Revelation, when the kings offer up their crowns, or their glory. Is there the line about the king, like the nations offer up their glory? But he omits the fact that exactly one chapter before, Satan gathered those very same nations, or kings of the nations, to go make war against the people of God. And they were destroyed and thrown in the lake of fire. So the very same people, nations, whatever, however you want to read that, kings, nations, kind of inconsequential, that end up offering up their glory after the coming of the New Jerusalem, were destroyed first. And so there's a way in which I think that what was destroyed and what's represented in that first part, that is the glory of the nations in as much as it is expressed in the civilizational impulse, which inevitably operates in the world according to the closed world of the serpent, on the serpent's principles. This is why the serpent is able to call them arms against God and the people of God. That is destroyed. But once that is destroyed, now all of a sudden, you create the conditions that the glory can be offered up. In other words, the sacrifice that is not sacrifice can begin to occur, and everyone can live in the fullness of the divine plenitude. There's no way for me to read that, to take that verse in isolation and read it as a support of the project of civilizational Christianity. That's not what it's saying. Otherwise, why did they have to be destroyed in the immediately prior chapter?
Yeah, and that's a good example of what, our interacting with the texts and disagreeing so thoroughly about lots of things.
It's so good, by the way. We should be grateful. I'm serious. We should be grateful for that, right? Because we're much more smarter. We're much smarter and much wiser when we can learn to listen and work together. And I'm sure if I were to have a conversation with Jonathan or Richard about what they were talking in that video, that there are things that they could say to me to address my concerns. And I'm pretty sure that I would find out that the place where we're actually standing, although it may not be identical, it's probably way closer than it might seem on the surface.
That was demonstrated on the video where they both said things at the beginning and the end and even all through that I was like absolutely on board with and thought, we agree on that. We agree on
right, exactly right. Yeah. That's often, particularly with Peugeot, my experience is that a lot of times we have exactly the same premises all along the way in the argument, and then somehow he arrives at a different conclusion, which suggests that one of us has an enthymeme that either we're not aware of ourselves, right? Or that, I'm gonna assume it's just that, and I'm not gonna assume who it is. It may be me. I may have it may be on my part where there's something like I have this unstated premise that I've just assumed that that's not even clear to my own consciousness, maybe even, or it could be the other way around. I don't know which way it is, but it's like I often find myself with him. It's like yes, absolutely. Wait, what? So yeah, so that's interesting.
Well, I know we need to go. You got to get on with your afternoon, and I've got to get to supper. But real quickly, I brought up sin, soot, and Glassenheit. And I think a better word is to break the German is nostalgia, because what I saw in the guy's video, that while I agreed with so much about what they were saying about our citizenship is is not in this world, it's with heaven, and all that we could nuance by talking more in depth about what that means, was the whole looking forward and past to that far green country in nostalgia, and to the extent that it would be a blessing to take your last communion and go to heaven for the jester, that this was a reward, and that this was the driver of all that St. Brendan was in pursuit of as he was looking to establish churches and cities and cultures, cities and camps and stuff along the way. That seems to me that it needs to be looked at a little more closely, because what I'm saying about sin, soot, and nostalgia is that in an economy of abundance, there's no place for that.
Right.
So what I would have called and subscribed to for much of the last 30, 40 years would be that theology of desire, that it's your desire for the far country that keeps you going and in search of where the Lord is drawing you to. But now I don't know. I don't really feel like I look longingly for another place in time or another set of circumstances myself. And so that led me to say, I don't think I have sin soot anymore. I recognize the presence, like the full presence and peace and satisfaction of abundance.
Right. Yeah. And right. And I think actually in the sermon that I just heard in church, like this Sunday, I think that's one of the things my priest was talking about, was like he was talking about if you have, if you really have the peace of God dwelling within you, then you can be joyful regardless of what the circumstances are.
Yeah.
The circumstances and the context are irrelevant. And that you can only be in that state by having just unshakable faith that God will provide what you actually need. And that's not only that. That's not will provide, but has already provided.
Yeah, I was going to say.
It has already provided everything that you need.
This is what
you need nothing else. You need nothing more.
Yeah, this is what I've taken so much of from Paul Axton's influence, has been his looking at Romans 7 as a description of the former life, and it's not at all a description of the normal Christian life.
Right.
So I had a college professor who said Romans 7 may be it's your experience as a Christian, and if that's the case, that's a separate issue. What Paul is saying in his argument here is that this is the life before Christ is known. So it's life with the law.
Right.
So for us to be divided and longing for something in the distance is still living in parsing out scarcity.
Yep.
So the Romans 7 strength of Paul Axton's body of work, and all that he puts out, it seems to always come back to Romans 7 and the insight there about it. This is not something we have to subscribe to. In fact, this is the lie. This is a well-crafted description of the way we were living before, but he said it in present tense, so everybody thinks it's a description of a divided self within even the Christian.
Yeah. That's right. Exactly. Yeah, that is. And I think that is. I think the reason we read it that way, Brian, is because of what Barfield described as the withdrawal of participation, because that's how we experience. Like, that's our experience of ourselves, is the experience of the divided man. And in some ways, this has been our state since the garden, since the fall in the garden. Like, there's like the fall itself, the eating of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is to fall into the state of the divided man. But what's happened over the course of our history is that we have become even more and more separate and divided, and less cohesive. We're atomized individuals with a very divided sense, even internally, of our own selves. And so the reason we want to read it that way is because that's what meshes with our own phenomenological experience of ourselves in the age of the withdrawal participation. But for a first century writer, in the first century, you're still much closer to the consciousness of original participation. And so that's Paul doesn't like. It is almost unthinkable that Paul would think about it in that kinds of terms of absolute separation and division. So,
yeah. Well, it's another big piece to look at, and when we bring Paul into it, I look forward to having him at our disposal for insight into how the abundance and scarcity topic and sacrifice can interplay with what his work has been in Romans 7.
Yeah, so I think like next up after this, I'll share it with him and make sure I bring it to his attention, and then I'll say, hey, I'd like to invite you into continuing this conversation. Do you have any thoughts as to where to go next in the conversation, or what you'd like to highlight, and kind of let Paul drive the next one?
That sounds good.
All right. Sounds good.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah,
I hope you all have a good evening. I know you missed Peekaboo, and I'm sorry to hear about that.
Yeah, thank you.
My thoughts are with y'all, and I really appreciate our conversation. Let's do it again.
All right.
All right. See you, Nate.